Samantha Jones. I teach geography. My specialty, I guess, in geography is GIS and physical geography, so things that have to do with forests, tree rings. This is informally the tree ring lab, I guess is what I call it. Kind of started when geography was in Hague-Sauer, so a year after I started teaching here, started in 2014, 2015, started developing my research program in dendrochronology. Fast forward to most recently, the types of work going on in here is looking at aspen growth rates to figure out how long does it take them to reach certain diameter thresholds, how big around do they have to be for specific cavity nesting birds. This is work with Minnesota DNR, mostly the folks out of the Red Lake Wildlife Management area. Folks up there working on that forest management plan started having questions about, are we leaving enough large diameter aspen on the landscape for certain bird species, woodpeckers in particular, those cavity nesting birds, because they excavate these large nesting cavities that then are used by other critters as well.
I'm Casey Molesky. I'm a BSU biology grad student, and I'm studying woodpecker nest ecology. So what types of trees they're using, what type of habitat, how old are the trees. There's a lot of variables in like why they're choosing these nest trees. And so through my 2 summers of researching up here, we're trying to figure that out. And woodpeckers tend to prefer aspen trees, so we're primarily nest searching in aspen habitat, and it's a heavily managed tree in the state of Minnesota. So we're trying to figure out, like, especially how old and how big the trees are that they're using, because typically the aspen's harvested way too early in Minnesota, usually around like 40 years old.
In the field, it starts with collecting a core sample from the tree. This is an increment borer. This is a tool of the trade. Looks simple, but it's actually a pretty sophisticated piece of equipment.
I'll try going for maybe right here. This looks a little bit more center of the tree. And the reason we try to go to the center is so it lines up better with trying to get into the what's called the pith, which is the center of the tree, to get a more accurate age. Oh, here it goes. And then the goal is not to go all the way through the tree, just to at least halfway into the center. And then I crank back, and hopefully nothing will be stuck. And then there's our core sample.
You have a small, kind of pencil-sized section of wood from that tree that you can look at the growth patterns to understand what was going on with that tree. And wide rings, which might be kind of hard to see in this sample, but wider rings were good years of growth for the tree. It was happy, quote unquote. It had plenty of resources, ample light and water and nutrients, wasn't affected by insects or other stressors. During years where the growth increments are very narrow, something was going on to stress the tree. Could be drought, could be lack of water, could be competition, could be all sorts of things. With regard to how that affects the size of the tree for cavity nesting birds, like the woodpeckers Casey is looking at, those patterns of fast and slower growth affect how long it takes a tree to reach that diameter threshold for whatever bird is going to hammer into it and build a nest.
One of the primary things for my study is taking DBH, and this is just a little DBH tape in centimeters, and it's at diameter at breast height. So because of this, I'll go a little bit lower because of this branch, but you just wrap it around the tree, line it up with the millimeter mark right here. So this tree is a little over 31 centimeters in diameter.
The increment core samples are put into straws, and then they come back to the tree ring lab. And here is where we prepare the cores so that we can look at them under a microscope and count the rings.
So the cavity is, I don't know if you can see it, but it's the big one at where the tree forks towards the top. There's a branch like almost sticking into the cavity. I see a feather in the cavity, so it's still being used, but we'll see if anyone pops their head out. And what's calling in the distance is a flicker, but in this cavity is a pileated, and they are surprisingly very sneaky.
The environment that's affecting trees is changing, and how that, whether it's rainfall patterns or insect outbreak patterns, that's a big question on the horizon too. How that is going to affect sort of the mix of trees that we see across the landscape, and looking at the past gives us some clues as to what we can expect in the future, and that's where the tree rings come in. So Kelly Larson and Carl Newman have supported the Tree Ring Lab through gift donations to fund essentially summer field work. So Caitlin Bergstrom was the first student working with me on this sort of project with Minnesota DNR looking at cavity nesting birds. And that gift fund essentially supported Caitlin's summer research in the same way that it's supporting Casey's. So it provided a stipend so that they can just focus on their research throughout the summertime and not have to like juggle a part-time job in the background as well. So that's been really huge, and being able to focus on the summer research and spend enough time in Beltrami Island State Forest and around Norris Camp and in that Red Lake Wildlife Management Area landscape, collecting the data to answer these questions, because that's where this all starts, is getting out there and being able to collect the samples to really know what's going on firsthand in the field.